And I was wondering, first question is, when did Bridgewater first make a commitment to sustainable investing? When was that decision made, and what's the reason for making it such a big priority at the firm?
Well, for us, it really comes down to what our mission is. And since Bridgewater's founding about 50 years ago, we've really had two clear goals, that everything that we do aligns to those two goals. One is this deep quest to deeply understand how economies and markets work. We're a macro investor that all day long, that's what we sit and think about. Can we understand the cause-effect linkages of the economies and markets? Goal number one. Goal number two really has to do with taking that understanding and then converting it into investment solutions that are very aligned specifically to the goals of our clients. So those are the two goals: understand economies and markets and convert that into investment solutions. So if you think about sustainable investing, actually that ties directly to both of those two objectives. And that's why we focus on it. So let's take one in turn. First of all, if you think about, is it possible to understand economies and markets without broadly considering issues relating to the environment, net zero, or even social issues? If you just look at the last couple of years of what has occurred in fiscal policy, monetary policy, how different economies have fared, how different markets have performed, so many of that can be explained, or some part of that can be explained by going back to drivers that link to the environment or social issues. A simple way of putting it is to say, who's actually making decisions in the economies? It's policymakers. So when you make fiscal policy, when you make monetary policy, it's companies when they make CapEx decisions, the way we just talked about it, when we look at banks and how they make decisions, consumers, and of course also investors. And if you ask the question simply, are we seeing the actions of those players be somehow influenced by sustainability considerations? The answer is yes. Therefore, we have to understand it. And then to the second goal, it's very clear that when we look at, if you look at a traditional investment portfolio and the objectives that were given by those who give the money to us, like asset owners, up until recently, it was really strictly, mostly about creating great risk-adjusted returns. And I think increasingly, and we can talk a bit about where that is, we see asset owners being clear and clear about the fact that actually they want great risk-adjusted returns, but they actually also want some, not all, but some want to align their portfolios to a sustainable future. And that's a significant change. And once you do that, that sounds very simple to say, well, okay, you're going to have an investment portfolio. It has to create great risk-adjusted returns. It has to be aligned to a sustainable future. How do you actually do that? For us, I think for everyone, that's a big, complex question. And I would say about 5 years ago, we said, let's stay hard at this question. And we really made a strategic priority to have great answers to that, being able to both understand it and build portfolios that were aligned to sustainable futures. So we do that really for the last 5 years. It's been a massive research effort for us.
And you had a long, you've worked at other places, including at Denmark's ATP, the country's biggest pension fund in Europe, one of Europe's largest. And I'm just wondering, given that sort of European perspective, how that's shaped your view and been helpful at Bridgewater.
Well, it's a great privilege when you get to work for an asset owner because you're very close to the ones who own the money. And you're very close to the purpose of what an investor does, which is ultimately to help somebody compound their money. And if you're in a pension plan, if you're the CEO of a pension plan, you know that returns really matter for your members. So kind of the notion of focusing on returns is very, very clear when you know that being able to raise pensions for the nation depends on returns. But you also realize, certainly if you're in a Scandinavian context, there is a certain societal expectations around what really kind of where the society is moving towards. And to the extent that as an asset owner, you can align your portfolio in that direction while still making great returns, that's very important. So in a way, what it taught me was both the humility of you managing somebody else's money, so you better make sure you make a return, but also that ultimately these sustainability objectives, they come out of, I think, the ultimate owners of it. And so that really started my work on that. And of course, in those countries, there's a long history of actually the pension system being very high performing, delivering great returns, while also investing sustainably. So for me, that was in a way the start of my journey.
Thank you. And I was going to open a question for the audience. Hope you guys will answer it. And the question is, should a sustainable investment portfolio be limited to only companies? And there are three options. You can only choose one. I'm not sure if they're up there yet or not, but well, we'll move on. Well, you have it. Okay, sorry. I was interested to see what the answer would be. But
oh, there you go.
Oh, there we go. Good. But, I mean, if you sort of answered this question already, but in a nutshell, how does Bridgewater define sustainable investing?
So for us, it's very clear. We would define sustainable investing as a portfolio where you have both financial objectives, but where you really want to align it to a sustainability objective. Now, that sustainability objective can be many things. For example, it could be you want to align your portfolio with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, for example. That's one thing that we do. It could be like we just talked about, or you just talked about in the previous panel, you want to make sure that your portfolio is aligned to the net zero. So those are examples of you have an explicit sustainability-oriented objective. For us, that's the starting point of a sustainable portfolio, a clear goal. Then second, it's about, okay, well, how do you actually know that a particular company or a particular security is aligned to a sustainable future? How do you know whether a company or whether one of these banks actually could be, you can say that they're net zero aligned? So that in a way starts a big research journey for us around the simple question. What's the simple question we should be able to answer to know whether company X is sustainable or is aligned to net zero? And usually we ask two simple questions. In general, we like to condense big complex topics to simple questions. The simple question here is, let's look at what the company does and let's look at how they do it. And then let's tie that back to the sustainability objective. And so with respect to net zero, for example, what we would look at is, okay, well, let's look at first spot picture. Is this particular company, do we believe that in terms of its products and services and its business behavior, do we believe that that company could be said to be aligned with net zero? And you have to look at that in a spot basis, like today, but then we know, of course, the whole challenge is that a lot of companies are not sustainable today. And so therefore the difficult part of the exercise becomes having a forward-looking assessment. And that's hard because almost definitionally, when you have to make a forward-looking assessment, sometimes the companies themselves don't even know if they're net zero aligned. They don't even have their full plan. So for an investor to figure that out is difficult. Difficult does not mean impossible. It just means difficult. And so a big part of what my day-to-day life looks like is to figure out what's a fundamental and systematic way of assessing a forward-looking transition plan for a company. And to answer the question of, do we think it's aligned? Yes or no? And all this, of course, is just the sustainability part. That comes on top of all the financial analysis that, of course, we do in these portfolios.
And I think what's interesting at Bridgewater is, you're not afraid to invest in high polluting industries, and you look for what you call carbon solution companies and carbon improvers. And what industries fit into these two buckets?
So in our sustainable portfolios, we want to make sure that we only invest in companies that either are sustainable today or are on a clear and credible path towards being sustainable. Now, I choose those words very carefully. Clear and credible. So not like a LinkedIn update, but like where we have done a systematic assessment and we say, do we think this company actually will be sustainable? Now, here's the, in a way, the obvious point about net zero is that if every company was sustainable in the world, we wouldn't need to focus on net zero. So the whole point is, where is the problem? The problem is in those sectors where we have high emissions. And if you look at that, if you in a way look at the intersection of where's all the carbon footprint in the world? Where is a normal, let's look at equities. How does a normal equity portfolio look like? And what's that intersection? What you find is, let's say 9 sectors or so, they represent most of the emissions. These, by the way, are sectors that are essential for the world. Like we need power generation, we need chemicals, we need transportation, we need buildings. I mean, we need these things. And so when you ask me, would we be willing to invest in those sectors? I think the central dilemma or challenge for investors with respect to sustainability is how do you, in a way, can you navigate between, on the one hand, being willing to identify companies that are not sustainable today but are on this credible path, but on the other hand, not just saying, look, everyone is going to transition, I'll invest in anyone. So therefore, this bar of saying clear and credible means that you would go in and look at a company. Let's look in the utilities. Utilities is a high emitting sector. Let's look at the ones, some have already made the transition, are green utilities, great. Some are in the process. And the ones that are in the process, they may have made commitments, but let's go in and look at, can they actually transition? Have they made specific commitments, the governance around the commitments, the green capex, and ultimately, do we think they'll transition? And some of these hard to abate sectors, it's really difficult to make that assessment. But I think if there is a company that is serious about it, has serious plans, has a credible plan, I think investors who want to be net zero aligned, they should support those ones. Now, it's not the only thing we invest in. And of course, a company that does not have credible plans, we would not invest in as part of our sustainable portfolios. But I think it's very important that one is willing to not run away from the carbon emissions problem, but run towards the carbon emissions problem. Then secondly, there are, of course, more like climate solutions. In other words, green tech or other things where you think, hey, this particular company may or may not be emitting, but it's producing something that the world needs in order to transition. It can be everything from, we know we need like an electrical grid. We know we need energy efficiency. We know there's all kinds of things, products that the world needs. And if you can find a company that's developing so-called climate solutions, great. That's a great thing to make sure that you support the alignment, to support the transition. And then, by the way, also, if you're an investor, there's a bunch of companies of the world that are a bit orthogonal to the emissions problem, meaning they're in low-emitting sectors, and so they're neither part of the solution nor the part of the problem. And I think for most investors, if you want to be a sustainable portfolio, that of course you can also invest in them. So it's both companies that are sustainable today, either by birth or because they've already transitioned, companies that are transitioning credibly, or companies that actually are providing some type of solutions to help others transition. So that's how we think about it.
And I know Bridgewater takes a macro approach to its investment strategy, but do you engage with companies, or how do you do your research? Is it?
Yeah, so as part of making, again, in our sustainable portfolios, when we make these forward-looking assessments, our desire is always to start with a fundamental understanding, like our own fundamental answer to the question of, is this company sustainable? Then we try to take that logic and we try to systematize it, meaning we try to be as rigorous as possible about writing down our logic for why do I think a particular company is sustainable, systematize it so that you can, kind of run your logic again and again, and to make sure that you always have an updated assessment of companies. But sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes you can sit and you can try to do your analysis as systematically as possible, but you need more. You need more information, especially when it's about forward-looking assessments. So by all means, we would supplement that work with really trying to see, is there anything else that we need to understand? And part of that could be speaking to the companies, part of that could be speaking to NGOs, part of that could be, speaking to all kinds of external experts to help us complement the picture or the assessment that we have, in a way, the systematic assessment that we have in-house. And there's a lot of people who talk about sustainable investing. I think it's one of the most exciting topics, but it's also a very complex topic. It's difficult conceptually, it's difficult analytically, it's very difficult from a data perspective. So it's not an easy task, but it's a very exciting task, and we try to bring the full force of Bridgewater's investment research platform to the challenge.
And do you, we do a lot of work on this at Bloomberg, but do you incorporate ESG ratings and scores into your analysis, or how does that figure into the? Yeah,
so in our sustainable portfolios, in a way we have to do, there's actually two basic questions one has to answer. One is a particular company sustainable or not? And B is, how should I hold this company? Just because you're sustainable does not always mean that you want to invest in it. But so those are the two questions. And with respect to the question of whether a company is sustainable or not, absolutely, we would go out and we would scour the world for relevant data that helps us answer these questions. It can be commercial data providers, it can be actual ESG raters, it can be academic data, it can be all kinds of data. And we will ingest that, but in a way we will ingest that with the purpose of building our logic. So if the question is, do we just use other people's ratings? The answer is No. If you ask the questions, do we look at it? Do we evaluate it? Is it part of like us having a, other people are trying to answer similar questions, you look at that, but ultimately we want to come up with our own answers, but then we want to stress test because maybe we got it wrong. And a lot of smart people are thinking about these questions, so by all means, let's look at as many people as possible who've thought about these questions and see if we can learn something. And we don't just, I think it's important in general, when there's a lot of debate around bad data or ESG providers and they show different results and how can you trust the whole thing. And my view on that is, look, in general, investing is hard. And investors have to do their homework and in a way come up with their own views on things. And imagine if we took out sustainability from this debate and we just said, we just had an investor who never did their own work and just relied on somebody else to do their work. I don't think we would call that a good investor. Same thing with sustainability. You have to do your own work. You have to actually look into these analytically complex questions and not just rely on somebody else's work. Use other people, integrate it, but ultimately come up with your own assessments.
And a lot of today has been spent on regulation and where we are. And from your seat, how important is what's happening in the SEC and in Brussels, various parts of the world that are working on new regulations, and how big a concern is greenwashing as it fits into that whole discussion?
Well, there's a number of different regulatory, I think, initiatives that have been underway around the world, and maybe you can bucket them into different things. Some have to do with transparency from companies, transparency from investors. A second thing has to do with the good old principle of do what you say and say what you do. Like if you say do something, do it. I think that's a very healthy approach to have. And then thirdly, there's part of a regulatory focus in certain countries that they really have to do more with regulators, basically asking the financial sector, have you thought about these risks? So all kinds of like stress testing, risk stress testing. So I would say maybe there are even other buckets, but at least those three ones. And they're playing out in a slightly different way across countries. But by and large, it's, from my perspective, since I am trying to build sustainable portfolios, having good, reliable data is great. Making sure that people who say they do something actually do it, I think that's also a great thing. And in terms of stress testing, we of course have our own way of making sure that we've thought about pertinent risks. So, but that's all very helpful. But I think, mostly I think I would say these three buckets are perfectly fine and are helpful.
We're running out of time, but I was interested in your thoughts on. The financial industry has come under some criticisms about not acting fast enough on the transition to net zero. Asset managers, insurers, banks, and I'm interested in your perspective on, is the financial industry doing enough? Do they have to get going? That type of thing.
So, of course, the financial sector is a big sector, and I can only speak on behalf of us. But I would say, in broad strokes, if you ask the question of how hard has the financial community thought about these challenges? If you look at the previous panel, and we look at the quality, I think, of the conversation, the details of how people are able to actually talk about sustainability. 10 years ago, the financial sector couldn't really do that. 5 years ago, I don't think they necessarily could do that. And then I can only speak for ourselves, just looking at the massive, resource commitment we are putting in to being able to actually understand these topics well. I think what that shows, by the way, I think the financial sector is a microcosm of the broader corporate sector and even the media, which is that maybe 10 years ago, few took it seriously, 5 years ago, more took it seriously. But today, just the level of understanding of conversation around these topics, I think, is high. And then you're absolutely right that there's a time for talk, there's a time for understanding, and of course, eventually, for everyone, all this has to translate. If you want to align yourself with a sustainable future, it does mean there's something in your portfolio or in your lending portfolio that has to look different. If you do all this understanding and talking and nothing changes, that's a problem. But at least, I'm an eternal optimist. I believe that, I think I believe the sector and the world will be on a path to transitioning. That's my personal hope and view.
Well, thanks, Carsten. I have a bunch more questions, but I will have to leave it there.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate your time, and thank you so much.